Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. Now, for those of us in the industry, the month of May is significant as it holds the one day in the year that commemorates press freedom. The United Nations World Press Freedom Day falls on May 3rd. And every year it becomes more significant as journalists' freedoms are restricted by governments and reporters are taking huge risks just doing their jobs. But press freedom is important not just for those in the media, but for everyone, with freedom of information seen as a barometer of a democracy. Well, I'm joined by Tsou Tzung Han, the Taipei bureau chief of the German public broadcaster Deutsche Welle, today to talk more about press freedoms here and around the region. So great to have you on the program with us. Thank you very much. Let me start very simply by how safe is Taiwan for journalists?
Well, if you look at the report of the Reporters Without Borders, you'll find that Taiwan has been ranked among like 40-something on their list of press freedom. That means that here in Taiwan, it's pretty safe for journalists to report whatever they want.
That's right. And I want to just start off with what would you say is the most obvious obstacle to true press freedom here in Taiwan?
I think the most serious problem is that how these media outlets are polarized. If you work in Taiwan or you live in Taiwan, you know, like it's very easy for people to tell which media is green, which media is blue, which media is red. That means that their political stance in terms of what they support, which party they support. So very polarized media environment dominated by sensationalism and the pursuit of the profit is probably the most serious problem. I can give you one example. Now the presidential election is coming. It will happen next January, right? It's next January, that's right. And for the election season, oftentimes in Taiwanese media, there will be an election package that being sold to all these different candidates. So we're talking about millions of NT dollars that be spent on these news content that the audience will not be able to find. So these undeclared advertising for the reader, it's very hard for the audience to detect or to find out that you're actually not watching a piece of news, but commercials or advertisement. I still remember there's one example of how one ex-city councilor, and he used to be a YouTuber, he did this experiment by calling one of the Taiwanese news media outlet, asking about how much he should pay for a news feature. And then the news media outlet just blankly just replied him that you can pay around $6,000 US dollars for news feature. So we have things like happening like that. So it's a democracy here, but at the same time, you can see like how commercialized and how media can be manipulated by these big corporations, and how like money is behind all this logic of running media here in Taiwan.
We've also spoken to Li Yan, a Taiwanese journalist who shared his experience as a media professional here in Taiwan. Take a listen.
I think polarization is the most important factors that would interfere with press freedom in Taiwan. Because I think everyone is aware that most of the Taiwanese media outlets have their own political stance and, inclination towards a specific political party. And that will certainly affect the way they do the reportings. And I think the easiest way to tell is from the way they refer to China. For those that are pro-KMT or even pro-Beijing, they will usually call it mainland or mainland China. And for those that are pro-DPP or pro-independence, they will simply call it China. And with this inclination, you can expect that they will have special stance when they are covering cross-strait relations or international politics.
Now, Joe, I see you smiled there. I see that resonates with you. But can you tell us and to our international viewers explain how they report on China is so important to Taiwan and how these next elections play out?
Before I talk about this, I just want to give you this background of how for 24 million people here living in Taiwan, we have more than 600 media outlets. So there are like broadcasters with different kind of forms, right? So we have so many different media outlets that driven by this pursuit of profits. And so when they produce this news, that they have to work with the big corporation that I've just mentioned. And for the audiences, for also the readers, most of them, when they read news or watch news, they watch it like it's an entertainment show. So mostly people are looking for what they have been identified with in the content instead of a public debate. So when Ian talked about how, the choice of words and the different kind of manipulation in these media, it sounds pretty absurd to me because that's the fact. That's what's happening in Taiwan, is that people are not actually reading or watching news to gain new knowledge or to learn something new, but to actually reinforce what they have already been believed in. So that's the biggest problem.
Now, in the most recent World Press Index published by Reporters Without Borders, Taiwan placed ahead of most other countries in Asia. Pauline Ademevel gave us an overview of the environment for journalists in the region.
The most important thing and the most important change in our index is the fact that the last 3 places are now occupied solely by Asian countries: Vietnam, China, and North Korea at the very bottom of our index. So the world's biggest jailer of journalists, China, is down again in our index, while Vietnam has really seen a hunt of independent reporters and commentators. So it is extremely worrying. And of course, North Korea, no great surprise, remains at the bottom. Taiwan is suffering from hostility as well in terms of press freedom. When we see that China has established such control on Hong Kong, we consider that it is extremely worrying. But the main thing is that, according to us, that the situation is deteriorating on the whole continent. Taiwan was still a liberal democracy, one of its biggest economy, and it's a place where the media freedom is respected, but its journalists suffer from a very polarized media environment right now.
And going back to the idea of China and why that's so important to people here, can you explain along what lines people are polarized, or these channels are polarized?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, we can tell which media support which party. So when people they have their remote controls, they will just switch to the channel that they think that they'll find the content they want. So for the KMT supporters, they'll watch certain TV channels. For the DPP supporters, they watch certain TV channels, and there almost no debate, or I'll say even communication between these channels. So oftentimes we joke here in Taiwan, if you have to have a full picture of the political situation here, you actually have to watch probably 5 to 6 channels to be able to tell what you can believe in. But at the same time, as I said, when they report on these different issues, especially on this cross-strait relations or on Chinese politics, then people tend to get information. If you ask people if they trust media here in Taiwan, it's less than 40%. It's around 30% of people that they find trustworthy of this news content.
Now, for our international viewers, the KMT is the main opposition party. DPP is the ruling party here, or current ruling party in Taiwan. And in the upcoming elections in 2024 of January, it's mainly those two parties that will be going head to head. Now, explain to us why these parties have so much influence on various television channels or various media outlets.
Well, I think behind it is still the commercial logic by how these corporations, because these media, they're owned by these corporate leaders or these bosses. So they would support different kind of a party because of their own interest. So if they are having a business in China, then they will probably work with this pro-China parties. And then when they buy a media, those media will apparently they will be more supportive to the friendly Chinese policies. Whereas if you look at some of the DPP supporters or the corporations that are supporting DPP, well, they might have their main business here in Taiwan or in the States, which is the opponent of China. So they will also have another logic of working or running the media outlet.
We'll be talking about China in a moment, but first let's take a look at another authoritarian regime in the region. Now, 2 years ago, Myanmar's military took power in a brutal coup, and the regime has been relentless in its suppression of the opposition, and along with it, the media. We spoke to Ong Kyo Mo, a Myanmar journalist who's currently in exile, and asked for his location not to be disclosed.
Press has been one of the most targeted thematic area by the junta since the beginning of the attempt coup. So as civil society organizations and many journalists who used to operate in country has fled to from the country, or either they are in a ethnic control area or they are in a neighboring country and trying to do their work from there as much as possible. And there are also many journalists and reporters who has been arrested, who has been killed unjustly, being able to see their family before they are being killed. And the press freedom has been tremendously shrunken, and journalists has been taken away from where they are based in many circumstances. And I think this is the worst situations in history that the journalist has suffered in Myanmar.
So, Joe, admittedly, the Myanmar situation is one that kind of makes all journalists' hearts sink when you see that and kind of see how difficult it is to get information out, and where journalists are literally fighting for their lives to get information out to people so that they can have understand what is happening in their countries. Now in Taiwan, as you said, the biggest obstacle is that political landscape that we face. But what we also are seeing is a lot of citizen journalists coming out, social media playing a huge role in getting information out and bypassing those, parameters put by corporations or by governments. Can you tell us what the social media and citizen journalism landscape here is in Taiwan?
Well, firstly, I want to respond to what's in the clip by talking about the situation in Myanmar, because I interviewed one Myanmar journalist. She was also in exile in Thailand. The situation is totally different for us and for them, because for them, they have to report the truth from outside of their country, whereas here in Taiwan, we're still lucky enough to be able to report here. And as you mentioned about citizen journalism, I think when we look at this problem, it's a bit different from how it works for Myanmar, right? Because in Myanmar, it's like they have this military government that's cracking down the journalism in their country. But here in Taiwan, we have a free press, but at the same time, people can also use internet as a tool to spread what they know. But oftentimes, it's very difficult here for people here to tell what can be believed because of what's been a troll or something very, very hot on the internet doesn't mean that's true, right? So in Taiwan, we often talk about the internet army, of how these public relation companies, also, as I said, for some of the media outlets, they will sell this election package, including of some of the internet celebrities, or what you call citizen journalists, that they can help you to boost your influence.
So if we can talk about the idea of misinformation being spread through those citizen journalists and being spread through people who perhaps don't have access to the information by spreading their opinions, and that's being taken as fact. Can you explain what the dangers of that is for Taiwan in particular as we come towards the election that you're seeing, and that you personally as a Taiwanese and as a Taiwanese journalist are concerned about?
Well, it's definitely the influence of an authoritarian regime, and that is China, right? Just across the strait. Because we know China tried to control Taiwanese media through proxies in the past, and now they actually directly manipulate production and the marketing ecosystem of media, journalists, and internet celebrity here, as I mentioned. So it's very unhealthy for democracy, like here in Taiwan, where we're actually facing this kind of interference from another government that they're trying to influence the election result here because they have their own benefits or advantage that they have to think of as an authoritarian regime. So they don't want you to have a fair election. That's what we've been seeing in the U.S. election and how Russia's being accused of interfering in it. So it's almost the same model that we're seeing here in Taiwan that copied by the Beijing government.
And that is very worrying. Well, you can't talk about crackdowns on the press without talking about China, as Joe said, a country which historically has the most heavily censored media in the region and the toughest restrictions. But in recent times, the Xi Jinping regime has doubled down on suppressing foreign journalists and international publications, making it even more difficult to report from China with stricter visa rules and sometimes bizarre visa cancellations. Here's the former Chinese state media journalist Thomas Polkin's take on the issue.
Sometimes they'll read a Wall Street Journal and they're like, how did they find out all this information about us? Sometimes even government officials did not know all this information. They read about it in the Wall Street Journal. And then they ask around, they found out it was actually quite accurate, okay? So this is actually very scary for these government officials. And remember, I mean, it's not a democracy. So what I saw, what it looked like that was going on was a case that so much information was getting exposed that I think the government felt as if too much was getting exposed and they felt embarrassed by it.
He makes so many different points there, but one of the things I want to zoom in on is what happened during the pandemic. It suddenly gave governments, not just in China, but across the region, leeway to impose restrictions on movement, restrictions on information being passed out, saying it is in the interest of the security and safety of the people. Can you tell us what kind of an impact the pandemic had on Taiwan's media landscape?
Well, I think there's not too many changes during the pandemic. Of course, there are restrictions of how journalists that they can report, but there's no limitation or restriction that what's happening in China, right? So what I have been seeing is that actually we have seen a bunch of international journalists traveling from mainland China here to Taiwan, but afterward they're stranded here. Even now, I know some journalists, they're still working here in Taiwan to report China. So that's what I have been seeing. As for Taiwanese journalists, I think during that time, because of some of the measures taken, that people can still report freely here in Taiwan. So that's what's different.
Well, one of the places hardest hit by China's restrictions is Hong Kong. Beijing's imposition of the national security law 2 years ago has all but snuffed out independent journalism. Steve Vines is an author and was a broadcaster and reporter in the city for more than 20 years. He left fearing for his safety soon after the sweeping national security law was imposed. He now lives in Hertfordshire in the United Kingdom.
I'd written a book about the protests in Hong Kong, the 2019-2020 protests, called Defying the Dragon, which had been removed from bookshops and was being removed from university library shelves. So, you know, all my work as a journalist had kind of been hit a barrier. I couldn't carry on doing that. That was one aspect. The other aspect was I was receiving threatening communications. People I knew very well had been carted off to jail, were facing very long prison sentences. Many of those people, even to this day, are still sitting in jail awaiting trial. Some of them are in solitary confinement in these jails. So, you know, it's a very terrifying situation. I'm not proud of the fact that I left Hong Kong. I never intended to leave Hong Kong, but it just struck me the situation was so bad and so insecure for somebody like myself that having the prospect of being able to leave because I had a foreign passport, I took it.
Now, Joe, I know Taiwan was watching very closely what was happening in Hong Kong, particularly during the protests and after the protests, mainly because of the narrative of China constantly calling on Taiwan to come into its fold, and also the threat of China. As you hear what Steve Vines says, what are the thoughts running through your mind?
Well, what's running through my mind is that how difficult for the journalists in Hong Kong to be able to work in Hong Kong, not only just in Hong Kong, but also in Taiwan. We know even though Taiwanese government say they will support this Hong Kong demonstrators or some of the journalists coming to Taiwan, but it's actually also very hard for them to actually get a job here. And we are reminded by the Taiwanese government for some of the occasions, especially related to national security, that journalists with Hong Kong passport, they cannot go to those events because of the concern of national security. So it's not only hard for them to work in Hong Kong, of course, because of national security law, but it's also they can be seen as not being able to trust for the Taiwanese government when they want to come here and work for Taiwanese media. I still know many of them. They're trying to stay there, and maybe sometimes they cannot tell their names, but they're trying very hard to report on the front line to tell people what's going on in Hong Kong, and also in China. But the situation is actually deteriorating for them.
You touched on this briefly. One of the basically effects or the results of China's crackdown, both in China and especially in Hong Kong, where there was a lot of foreign media and foreign media bases, is that a lot of them have moved to Taiwan to report on China, to set up a base here to report on the region. Can you tell us how that, if at all, has changed reporting here in Taiwan, particularly with the way they're reporting on Taiwan, having to, in a sense, justify their presence here?
Well, it's actually good for the Taiwanese people when you have more and more international media coming to Taiwan, that they be able to make really good reports with depth. So people have different choices, and people like to say Taiwan is now be seen on the international stage. But at the same time,
is there enough reporting on Taiwan itself, or is most of it going out to the reporting about China and China-Taiwan? Do you find that people are now reporting, giving Taiwan the voice it needs?
Well, yes, in a way, but still, I think there is also a worry that all these international media, that their purpose is to actually elaborate or to talk more about the conflicts. So there's a way of this war drumming coming up, like how it's very dangerous for Taiwan to be caught in this conflict with China, but neglecting the fact that Taiwanese people are here living with thriving democracy and also our own way of democratic system. So it's like a sword with different sides, that there are good, also bad things happening for more and more international media outlets coming to Taiwan. But generally, I'll still say that it's good, right? Because more information is good for people's decisions. So generally speaking, it's good, but there are also some worries that lies behind.
Now, as you said, Taiwan's got a thriving democracy, yet its press is still far from perfect. What needs to be done, you say, to change it here, to make it far more transparent and kind of give journalists far more freedom to report on the things they need to report without being influenced by any bias? What needs to change?
From my point of view, personally, I think there should be a thorough education on media literacy and to try to rethink. So it's time to abandon the user's content and to make the media owners to rethink this strategy. I think that's probably the best way that we can start to do.
And speaking of rethinking media strategy, and what about digital media? What kind of a role does that have to play in Taiwan for giving people more choices and perhaps more less influenced or less biased choices?
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely you'll find more and more internet media outlets that's becoming more and more important and become the main source of people's news, also information, right? But as I said, it's also because it's very easy for people to mix misinformation, fake news, and real news. So it's still important to be able to teach the audience or the viewers that, like how important the source is, where it's coming from, and if you can double check or fact checking websites, things like that. So especially the well, the more the merrier in a way, but it's also a challenge for the readers or audience when they have so many choices and when they have so little time to double check or do fact checking.
Well, Tsou, we're just about running out of time here, but before we go, I want to leave you with this tribute from Steve Vines to the journalists that are still persevering in Hong Kong.
Now, for the people who remain in Hong Kong, there are two avenues. One is to shut up and simply try and operate within the parameters of the regime. Number two is to leave the industry altogether. Those are the most obvious things to do. Number three, and this does involve a few courageous people, is to try and carry on being an independent media, being an independent journalist, not seeing your job as being a mouthpiece of the government. This is a dangerous and difficult route, but people are still doing it. I'm actually surprised by how many people are doing it rather than the fact that nobody's doing it.
And with that, we say thank you to Tsou Tzung Han. It was great to have you on the program. Thank you so much for your insight and your time with us. And from Taipei, on behalf of the Connected team, I want to convey our respect and gratitude to the journalists around the world who risk their lives and freedom every day simply to do their jobs. And to our viewers, it's been good to have your company. Goodbye and stay connected.